The final segment covers sodium and water homeostasis. We'll start with sodium homeostasis first. Remember these fluid compartments that we talked about. Now, water is always going to want to equilibrate. So, there are certain electrolytes that are maintained in the extracellular versus the intracellular fluid. The first is sodium in the extracellular space. The second is potassium in the intracellular space. And we're always going to try and balance out the concentration. So, now that those are the primary, we're going to also look at the secondary, which are urea and calcium, but they have less of an effect on the actual flow of water than sodium and potassium. So let's talk about the definitions of water versus volume. And I remember having nightmares about this when your instructor talked to us about how sodium regulates water, but water and volume don't regulate one another, and I just couldn't follow. So the way that I've set it up is to understand that volume is extracellular. It's that measurable volume inside of the vessels usually, and so I say volume is equal to effective circulating volume, which is the amount of volume that we can actually adjust and do anything with. Water, however, is a combination of both extracellular and intracellular. So I think about it as water being total body water. So, for example, this is why this matters. So imagine somebody with edema and their whole body looks like a balloon. They're fluid overloaded, but for some reason they're hypotensive and have very little fluid inside of their blood. And you're like, well, they have plenty of water. Why isn't it going where it needs to go? And you'll talk about the clinical correlations of that eventually, but just understand that they aren't always regulated together. So the first we're going to talk about is sodium homeostasis. Now, this is the balance between sodium coming in and going out of the body. So when you have positive balance, then you're going to have a higher intake than excretion. Negative balance is a higher excretion than intake. But the osmolality is going to try and equilibrate at all times, so it should not change. Now, sodium is going to regulate the volume. So sodium follows that water. A higher sodium means a higher volume. And like we said, volume is effective circulating volume. Now, the clinical correlation of this is really interesting because you can have hyponatremia and either be isotonic, hypotonic, or hypertonic, and you can have hypovolemia, euvolemia, or hypervolemia. So you can tell that even though sodium is low, you can have different volume statuses based on the pathophysiology of the disease that you have. And if sodium and water were always regulated together, then you could only have hypernatremic hypervolemia and hypovolemic hyponatremia. Now, he gives you kind of this story about this man who has a low sodium diet. And I kind of broke it up into a timeline because I remember not being able to follow it very well. But let's talk about this story. So there's a man with low sodium intake. At day 0, he's in positive balance because the excretion is outweighing the intake because it's a low intake. And his weight's at 70 kilograms. Now, we're going to switch him immediately to a high sodium diet. And within 3 to 5 days on that high diet, he's going to turn to a positive balance. He's going to continue that positive balance until it equals out. At more than 5 days, he's going to end up having equal balance for the sodium intake and output, but he's actually gained a full kilogram or retained a liter of fluid based on that higher level of sodium coming into his body. Now, if we were to switch him at that point once again back to a low sodium diet or initiate diuretics in another 2 to 5 days, even though he has all that excess that's built up in his body of fluid and of the sodium, he's going to equilibrate once again. So the whole entire big picture point is that no matter what you do to the kidneys to try to mess with the sodium, they're always going to try and balance it out. Now, if you lose volume, you're going to initiate some regulators that say, hey, kidneys, hold on to it, and vice versa. Now, he even mentions that it requires you to have an 8% weight gain to develop edema. That's because we're able to regulate sodium inside the vessels very well until they get somewhat overwhelmed. Now, if they get overwhelmed, then it doesn't matter how much we try to equilibrate what's inside the cell, it starts to, or inside the vessels, it starts to leave. Then he starts to talk about this sodium balance in terms of these boxes. And for some reason, my brain can't process these boxes. And so here's an overview if you want, if your brain works this way. But I've kind of separated into kind of a movement because I think that everything in the kidneys is so difficult because it's constantly moving and shifting. So normal sodium balance, we talked about 60% water, 2/3 intracellular, 1/3 is extracellular. Everything's balanced, fluids normal, and whatnot. If we have a negative sodium balance, that means we're excreting more sodium than we're taking in. So the sodium gets excreted. From there, what's going to follow the sodium is water. So water ends up traveling out, and as you can see, the size of this extracellular compartment decreased. That's what happens in volume depletion. Now, normally, ADH is going to reabsorb water, but because there's a lower concentration of the sodium itself, because the sodium led first, then the body doesn't want to bring in more fluid with ADH and reabsorb more water because then it just dilutes this substance. And we don't want a diluted substance. We want the appropriate ratios, right? So as a result, the water and sodium here are going to be excreted into the urine. Now let's move on. Let's pretend that there's a positive sodium balance. We're taking in more sodium than we're putting out. What's going to happen is that from that sodium, it's going to fill in that extracellular space, and you're going to end up absorbing water from, or reabsorbing water from the tubules. So ADH will respond and say, hey, we have a high concentration of sodium here. We need to pull some fluid back in order to dilute this back to a normal value. And as a result, sodium is going to it's going to stay inside of that extracellular compartment. It's going to expand it, and it's not going to affect the intracellular compartment because remember that the primary ion that we care about here is going to be potassium. So it's already happy. The charge, it's going to balance out because we've diluted the water, and the intracellular is going to be unaffected. Now, if there's water excess, this is different than sodium excess. So think of water being the primary driver. Those people that drink a lot of water for the radio contest is what we're talking about here. So they're putting a whole lot of water inside this extracellular compartment. And that kind of bulks up and gets bigger, but before it does that, it wants to equilibrate between the two. So both are going to end up being diluted and bulked up, and the osmolality will decrease because we have the same number of fluid, but it's diluted. There's less particles to fluid ratio. As a result, that serum sodium concentration is going to decrease. Now, in the other circumstance where there's water depletion and water is moving from inside of those cells, extracellular and intracellular equaled out area, we're going to lose water from both. These are people who have dehydration from long trips, long hikes, things like that. So as a result, you're going to increase the osmolality because there's a higher concentration of the solutes in both the intracellular and extracellular spaces. Obviously, there has to be something regulating this. So we talked a little bit about ADH, but there are certain sensors in the brain that are going to tell our body what to release. So afferent regulators are going to be atrial stretch. So when the heart stretches too large, heart atria or ventricles, and the body says, hey, we have a lot of fluid. We need to adjust it. There's baroreceptors in both the carotid bodies and the aortic arch that are determining how much stretch is on those vessels based on how much fluid they're holding, as well as the stretch on the afferent renal arteriole. Now, as far as the efferent, this is what the response is going to be. So we're going to have a balance between the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system and the natriuretic peptides. So the RAS is going to increase sodium retention. We want to hold on to sodium in water. For natriuretic peptides, they're going to cause natriuresis, which is the removal of sodium. So when these two are in balance, we're great. If something goes wrong, then these either natriuresis or sodium retention can occur in order to maintain the GFR, to maintain the fluid and the water and the sodium inside of each compartment. Additionally, there's renal sympathetic nerves and some other mechanisms, as well as secondary hormones or messengers that are released in order to tell us to hold on or release more water or sodium. So the final thing that I want to touch on here is talking about the renal anatomy that we've already addressed a little bit of. Remember that a large portion of it is in the cortex versus the nephron that's in the medulla. And we've talked about osmolality quite a bit, but your instructor goes into some depth about this countercurrent system, which is very important, but it also is used to more illustrate a point. And the point is that up here in the top parts, the cortex parts of the glomerulus and nephron, we're going to have an osmolality of 300 approximately. It's equal to the blood. However, as we go down this segment, we are concentrating and diluting blood back and forth, as we talked about in the nephron video, in order to absorb the right amount of water and solutes. So as we go down, the concentration gets really, really concentrated as water is being pulled back into the blood. And as a result, we get rid of more solutes, and then eventually we concentrate down further once again and allow for excretion of urine. Now, that is all thanks to ADH. If we didn't have ADH, then we wouldn't be able to do that in the collecting duct, and we'd never end up reabsorbing enough water in order to maintain those volumes. And I think that the hardest part about this is that there are multiple different areas where we have osmolality, either the capillaries, the interstitium, or inside the tubule, but understand that it gets more concentrated as we go down, because we're pulling more water out in that descending limb, and then more solutes are leaving in the ascending limb, and so we're able to cause a more dilute urine. Here's that visual representation of what the osmolality looks like when you have ADH versus when you don't. No, high ADH, you're going to end up with really concentrated, low amounts of urine. Without ADH, you're going to have a large amount, up to 12 liters of urine with a very, very low osmolality.